Australia is in a recession, at least on a per-person basis. Australia's GDP data has landed and is really not good, because GDP per person has decreased, and has been decreasing for the past 5 quarters. It fell 0.4% in the latest reading, much like it did in the prior reading, and GDP per person fell 1.5% over the past year. Now, while headline GDP notionally increased, it only increased 0.2% in the latest quarter, and only increased 1% over the course of the year. And as a result, the only way to get GDP growth is by increasing the number of people. Now, Jim Chalmers has tried to shift blame in the lead up to all of this negative data. He blamed the RBA for smashing the economy, to use his words. He claimed the RBA was keeping rates too high for too long, it seems. However, as I've talked about previously, this is a little bit misleading. It is a little bit of an obfuscation because it clearly begs several questions, chief amongst which is why is it that the RBA needs to keep rates so high? The RBA isn't doing it out of fun, the RBA is doing it for a reason. And the reason is that RBA needs to get inflation under control. And this then begs the question of what exactly is causing this inflation. To which the answer to that is it's a combination of government policies, which worsen productivity, and an increasing spending, which itself is unproductive because it's done in a wasteful manner. And while Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese like to try to blame external factors, inflation overseas is actually going back down toward target as well, whereas inflation in Australia has remained rather sticky and intransigent. Indeed, in other countries, such as in Canada for example, there have been reductions in interest rates, and the United States looks like it's going to see a rate cut any time now. Australia, however, is out on a limb. In Australia, interest rates are likely to remain high for quite some time. And as I've just alluded to, it really isn't the RBA's fault, rather is the fault of the source of the inflation, which is the federal government. Now, this GDP data has many negative attributes. I've already talked about the decline in GDP per person on a quarterly basis for the past 5 quarters. I've talked about the anemic headline GDP growth. However, there's some other data here. Firstly, productivity fell 0.8% in the latest quarter. This is bad. GDP per hour worked is falling, and it has been for the past 2 quarters. People are less productive when they are working. This is interesting because AI was supposed to revolutionize work and increase productivity. So if AI genuinely is increasing productivity, but productivity is actually decreasing overall, it really begs the question of why. Now, there's probably no one reason for this. There are probably several factors that are all compounding. But I would posit that it is a general sense of burnout that is causing people to be less productive in their current job and or less productive when they need to take second jobs in order to make ends meet. People are feeling poorer, and they're feeling that they are falling behind. And rightly so, because people are in fact seeing a reduction in their disposable income. This therefore makes people feel more burned out. It makes people feel as if they are exerting effort just to go further and further behind. It would be no surprise, therefore, that people would be less productive and less motivated when they go out and work, particularly in a tight labour market where people know that their job is relatively secure generally. Furthermore, people might need to go out and get second jobs in order to make ends meet. But that increases burnout in and of itself because people are now working more hours, which in turn decreases efficiency. Furthermore, the hours worked in that second job are often a little bit less productive than those in the primary job. For example, the person's primary employment might be in a slightly higher skilled source of labour, and therefore we see a reduction in the GDP per hour worked. Perhaps also we need to add on some of the other policy settings the government has brought in. These could include IR-related legislation and various rules, such as the government's move toward same job, same pay, which in essence basically means people get paid the same, regardless of how productive and effective they are when they are on the job. It is a deterrent for companies paying more for more productive workers. And this therefore disincentivizes workers to be more productive because they know they simply won't get paid more than their other counterpart. The fall in productivity is rather bad because it worsens inflation. After all, the best way to get around inflation and to reduce inflation is to increase supply, and you increase supply by increasing labor productivity. But that simply is not happening because productivity is going down for many reasons. Second, government spending has underscored what little GDP growth we have. Household consumption was weak. It fell 0.2%. it detracted 0.1 percentage points from the GDP reading. This was due, amongst other things, to reduced discretionary spending. Household consumption grew at the slowest rate since September 2021, which was during the Delta variant during the pandemic. In essence, household consumption is really lagging behind, and is part of the reason why GDP growth is not great. Discretionary spending fell 1.1%, even if spending on essentials increased by 0.5%. This is in line with concerns about falling disposable income, which is falling, or amongst other reasons, the impact of inflation, the impact of grant creep, and the impact of higher rates. Government consumption increased 1.4%. Government expenditure increased 0.3 percentage points to the GDP figure. This was driven, for example, by continued strength, to use the ABS's terms, in social benefits and households-related spending from the government. This therefore would suggest that the government spending is really propping up GDP. In essence, the government, to try to avoid the appearance of a recession, goes out and spends like a drunken sailor. The government is trying to paper over the problem that exists without solving the problem. Not only that, the household saving ratio also remained low at 0.6%. People are spending less, and this is because they don't have the money, not because they are going out and saving. I.e., the whole situation looks rather bad. GDP is growing at a very, very slow pace. GDP per person is decreasing. GDP per hour worked is also decreasing. Productivity is falling. There is a per capita recession. Government spending is propping up GDP figures, and immigration is propping up GDP figures. Without immigration, we would be in a recession. Now, of course, this then raises the question about the appropriate level of immigration, which itself is a separate topic. However, it is worth noting that immigration is really enabling the government to show GDP growth when in fact GDP per person is decreasing. In short, therefore, the GDP data is bad. The government's unproductive spending and counterproductive policies make the productivity issue worse. The spending, as I have alluded to, is unproductive. And as I've talked about in prior videos, this is because when the government goes on and spends taxpayers' money, it isn't costing the politician anything. Rather, the politician is in fact buying votes. They are pork barreling, so they benefit from the profligate and wasteful spending, whereas the taxpayer loses, and that spending is unproductive, and therefore it increases inflation without an offsetting increase in productivity to get around that increase in inflation driven by an increase in demand. That is, the government has an incentive to go out and do myopic things that paper over the underlying problem, while trying to blame shift and blame anyone else, whether it's the RBA, the supermarkets, the banks, or whatever, for the problems that we see in the economy. However, in reality, the problems are caused by the federal government, not the RBA or anyone else. And blaming the RBA is like blaming the firefighter who comes along and puts out the fire. The government is simply blame shifting here. And unfortunately, everyday Australians are the ones that suffer from this overall mess. And it appears the government has no clear plan to try to either increase disposable income in a meaningful manner, reduce inflation in a meaningful manner, or increase overall productivity in a meaningful manner. Rather, the government's policies at the moment appear to be to try to blame shift and to try to divide the electorate, so that they can perhaps excoriate or target a minority group of people as being the culprit for the underlying economic woes. The problem with that is you eventually run out of minorities to blame. You eventually run out of industries to blame for all of the woes in the economy. And when you've gone through all of the industries or all of the sets of people, you eventually end up with everyone being unhappy with your government, and everyone seeing how hollow the government's rhetoric is, and how hollow and unproductive the policies ultimately are. However, we are stuck with this government for a little while, and I would be interested to hear your thoughts about whether Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese are making things better, or in fact, making things worse. Let me know that in the comments below.